Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you to the YMCA for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I know Angela Davis spoke here last year. It's an honor to occupy the same space. I'm nervous. There's a camera. I'm going to try to ignore it. So the talk is called Living Restoratively in a Punitive World. I guess I want to elaborate on what a punitive world is. A lot has been happening in the news. Trayvon Martin was killed a few years ago, or I think it's been that long. Michael Brown more recently. A little bit before that, we had a similar event here in Champaign with Kewan Carrington. And when things like that happen, we hear calls for justice. We hear them from our neighbors. We make them ourselves. We hear them on TV. And it's become clear what that means. We want justice. What we want is we want somebody to suffer. We want somebody to pay. So I want to do this thing where I put the microphone down for a second. And I'll try to speak up. So before harm happens, we say that there's some equilibrium. It's not that everybody is equal. There's all sorts of inequality. But in relation to each other, before harm happens, we can sort of represent it like this, with 2 palms, where each palm is a person. And if this person harms this person, then we can represent that like this, right? There's harm that happens, and this person this person suffers in some way. This person has something taken away from him or her. And so calls for justice say, well, to have justice, we have to have justice. We have to have fairness, and so we have to do something to this person to bring him or her down, right? To create a little suffering so that there's fairness. And we have all sorts of things we talk about. We talk about an eye for an eye as a way to represent that. We talk about the punishment must fit the crime, right? And this is the way our criminal justice system works. Our criminal justice system is designed to ask, really very fundamental questions. Who did the wrong thing? How do we punish that person so that that person doesn't do the wrong thing again, and so that others will know that if they do that wrong thing, they too will be punished, right? Does that sound like our justice system? But it's not just our justice system, right? Everywhere else we go, the world is the same way. There are people in the schools whose job it is to say, well, let's figure out who did the wrong thing, and let's figure out how do we punish this person so that our schools will be safe, and so other people don't think that they can get away with doing that thing. And if we leave the school and we go home, we have the same sort of ideas applying there, right? So we say, spare the rod, spoil the child. There's sort of an assumption that in order to raise moral, fair-minded, good human beings, we have to be willing to punish them for their transgressions. This is sort of our dominant, prevalent notion of justice. It is so dominant that I think a lot of us, until we sort of start to question these things, have a hard time even imagining how can we do justice any other way. But it doesn't work as well as we'd like to think that it works. So the criminal justice system, I'll talk about the youth justice system for a moment. We sort of have the idea that 60% is passing, right? A 60% success rate in school. It's not a great grade, but you pass. So I'm curious, do you know what the recidivism rate is for juveniles who are incarcerated nationwide? That is, what percent of them upon release wind up being incarcerated again? So I heard 90%. It's not that high. It's a little lower. I heard 80, 70. It's about 70% nationwide. So 70% of youth who are locked up will be locked up again. So the success rate is about 30%, right? And I think that's failing. I think it's failing the young people. I think it's failing our communities. But it's not just in the youth justice system. So if we go in the schools and we look at zero tolerance policies, and we look at the prevalent punitive methods that the school used to enforce discipline, the detentions, the suspensions, the expulsions, we can all working well. So rather than memorizing, if you don't mind, I'm going to read to you just a few lines. This is actually from a chapter that I wrote with Angela Davis's sister, Fania Davis. So this is about the school data. While suspensions purportedly increase safety and academic achievement, a major study concluded that, quote, higher suspending schools reap no gains in achievement, but have higher dropout rates and increase the risk that students will become embroiled in the juvenile justice system. Being suspended once in 9th grade doubles the dropout rate from 16% to 32%. And a single suspension triples the chance of juvenile justice involvement within a year. Additionally, high suspension rates likely diminish school and community safety by increasing student disengagement, diminishing trust between students and adults, and removing students from adult supervision for extended periods. The research findings are so unambiguous that in 2013, the American Pediatrics Association concluded that suspensions do not make schools safer and called for pediatricians to urge schools to end them except as a very last resort. The debate around child rearing practices, it continues and evolves. We recently had the case of Adrian Peterson, a football player for Minnesota Vikings, who was indicted for child abuse for using physical punishment on his 4-year-old. And that created a debate because part of Peterson's response was, well, this is the way I was raised, this is the way my cultural community believes children should be disciplined. And indeed, there are many communities, and these communities cross racial lines in many parts of the United States that continue to value and believe in the role of physical punishment. But wherever you stand on that debate, there's not much debate about the role of punishment more generally. There's a very prevalent idea that this is, that kids need to be punished. Even though in our other relationships, with our friends, with our family members, we somehow manage to work these things out without punishing each other, at least not intentionally. I think I'm not going to try to present you with data about whether punishment works in families, but I'm going to start to talk about some personal experiments that we've had in our home and just start to tell you a little, some few stories about an alternative. So the restorative justice alternative, I need to put the microphone down for a second. So we're here again, right? We're here, where this person has harmed this person. And so our punitive process is that, okay, we're going to punish this person to create justice. Restorative justice does the opposite. It says we're going to create justice by restoring this person, by making things right that were done wrong, by fixing the harm, by restoring relationships so that we once again have justice. Specific ways are many, and there are lots of different restorative practices. The city of Oakland, as well as its neighbor in San Francisco, both have district-wide
mandates for schools to do restorative justice. And Vanya Davis runs the RJOY project in Oakland, which stands for Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. But what's interesting about these mandates, and of course they exist because there's a growing recognition that punishment isn't working, that zero tolerance isn't working, and that we need alternatives, but there isn't yet a clear sense of what those alternatives need to look like. So the schools were given a mandate to create restorative responses to school discipline issues, but they weren't told how to do it. And so what that means is each school had to figure out for itself what to do, and they're all doing sort of different things. And that's part of the experiment, and that's sort of where we are. Restorative justice is, in many ways, a centuries-long tradition. There are indigenous communities all over the world, certainly North America with with First Nations people, in South America, in Africa, indigenous people all over the world have traditions that are rooted in restorative justice. But the modern contemporary movement is about 40 years old, and it's growing, and the United States behind the pack. Right, so in Australia, in New Zealand, in England, in many other places in Europe, there's a much more vibrant, institutionalized, restorative kind of justice system being developed. But the U.S. is coming on board, and so this is where we are. We have school districts that are starting to experiment with things. But there are some underlying principles that all of these restorative programs share. One of them is that they're dialogue-based. There's the idea that rather than telling people what needs to happen next, we're going to use a dialogue process to do two things. For people to understand each other, and as part of that, understand what impact they have in general, but what impact their specific actions had on others. Right? So understanding impact. And the second one is for everybody to take self-responsibility to figure out how to make things right. It sounds pretty elementary, pretty basic, so I want to tell a story that starts to kind of get into the complexity of each of these. So I want to start with the first piece, the part about understanding impact. So this is a family story. This is a story about some conflict that I had with my wife. We at the time, I think, were married for about 15 years. We have 2 kids. We've been living in Urbana for the past 10 years, so just kind of giving you a little bit of context. So here's what happened one day. It was a nice day, much like today. It wasn't raining, wasn't cold. This is important. And I came home in my car. And I have the idea that I'm coming home just for a minute. I don't remember what the purpose was, but something like I'm going to grab something and get back into my car and go and do whatever it was that I was going to do. And so I park my car in the middle of our driveway, and I go in the house, and I get stuck there. I don't leave as I intended to do in a few minutes. And my wife comes home, and she can't park her car in the garage because my car is in the middle of the driveway. And she also can't park her car in the driveway because my car is in the middle of the driveway. So she parks the car on the street in front of the house. And I mentioned it was a nice day, and so she walks, a few extra feet, and she comes into the house, and she's upset with me. Because I inconvenienced her. And so she's not super upset. She's a little bit upset, but she lets me know she's a little bit upset. And my reaction is, does anybody know what my reaction is? Yeah, some version of, what's the big deal? Like, so you walked a little further, it's a nice day, no harm done, is what I said. And what do you think happened next? She got more upset, right? Why? Do you know why? Yeah, because I completely misunderstood what she was upset about. It wasn't because I inconvenienced her. Oh, I should tell you a little bit more information. That wasn't the first time that happened. So, and it wasn't the second, right? But the previous time that it happened, we had a conversation that went something like this. Elaine says, so how much time would it take you to park your car, on one side of the driveway? And I said, I don't know, an extra 2 seconds. And she said, well, would you be willing to do that next time? And I said, of course. Why wouldn't I be willing to do that? And I meant it. I totally meant it. And then, of course, I didn't, right? Because, because I didn't think that the car would be there when she came back. So, yeah, the harm and the conflict, she's not upset because I inconvenienced her. She's upset because my actions in her mind, not in my mind, but in her mind, my actions communicated that I don't care enough about her to track our agreement and follow through with it, right? I don't care enough about her. And if you go a little bit deeper, and I'm not saying it went this deep, but if you go a little bit deeper, does she matter enough to me? Do I love her enough to do these small things? So as long as I'm focused on it's no big deal, you weren't inconvenienced, she's only going to get more upset. We're only going to have one of those really unpleasant arguments that leave everybody feeling poorly. It's only going to go well so there are a couple pathways. One, she's clear in her mind why she's upset with me, and she's willing to articulate it, and I'm willing to hear it. Or I can realize what's going on, without her articulating it, and did what you did. You sort of read between the lines, go underneath the act, and really understand the harm that she perceives was done. It doesn't matter if I agree with it, because in my mind, I totally care about her. She totally matters to me. I really love her. And I'm not intending to communicate any of this stuff, right? But if we're going to restore things, I have to understand the impact of my behavior on her. Right? So that's the first part of a restorative process. The idea of bringing people together, creating conditions for them to really hear each other, for them to talk to each other, to speak their truth, to really hear each other and understand their impact. And then from there, to take responsibility to figure out how to make things right. There's one other important difference between restorative approaches and punitive approach, or sort of our traditional approaches to justice. And it's the notion of who's involved. We kind of think of conflict as happening between two parties. There's, and of course in the criminal justice system we call them the offender and the victim, right? The person or persons who did the harm, the person or persons to whom the harm was done. In a restorative process, we include those parties because why wouldn't we? But we include a third party too, because we understand that there's another group of people that are involved. The group of people that created conditions for the harm to have happened. And this next is part of the same group. Those who are impacted by what's going on. Okay? So if you imagine an argument in a school between two kids that leads to blows, as you picture it, you're probably also picturing another group of kids that are watching what's going on and participating, possibly verbally, right? Or that you're imagining other kids who are impacted by what's happening because their story about what's going on is, it's a good thing that it's happening to him because it could be happening to me, and I better watch my step. Right? So in a restorative process, we want to make sure that all those folks are at the table because they're involved, they're part of it. It's hard to step out of the philosophical idea that justice equals punishment. And in some ways, I've been surprised by how hard it is to convince those that I thought would be easiest to convince that the alternatives are better. So I had this idea when I started working with the kids at the detention center. So these are incarcerated kids. These are kids that have been brought into the juvenile justice system. And they're being incarcerated in that moment. And I sort of had the idea that, well, they would be resentful, they would be angry, they would believe that even if they did something wrong, and indeed they've done things wrong, that they would have preferred to be treated differently. And sure enough, they would have preferred to be treated differently. But we had this interaction. There's a film that I showed them. It's a film of high school kids in Pennsylvania. Actually, they were a little bit older. They had just graduated from high school. Some of them were about 19. So I'm describing a film called Burning Bridges. And what these young people did is, it's a summer after high school. They were out. They were excited about, sort of being done with school, looking forward to the next part of their life. They were looking to blow off some steam. They decided to have some fun, and what they thought might be fun was to burn down a covered bridge, like a wooden covered bridge. And in this part of Pennsylvania, Bucks County, these are actually historical kind of they're historical bridges. They've been around for a long time. They're kind of part of the county's history. They're in the folk art. They're in the, just people like these bridges. So they tried to set the bridge on fire, and they were unsuccessful. And so they made a plan. They went and they got all sorts of things like lighter fluid, and they came back. And I'm telling you all this because, for you to understand that it was premeditated, right? And they came back with these things, and then they tried again, and this time it worked. They set the bridge on fire, and it burned. It really burned. There were six of them who did that. It burned to the ground. And the community got pretty upset because, again, they like this bridge. At first it wasn't clear who did it. And so, the local media coverage, sort of talked in the abstract. And part of it was a real dehumanizing process. What subhuman would do something like this was actually a headline and we see this in the documentary, was actually a headline that the local paper ran. And eventually, the police figured things out, and the 6 individuals were identified, and they all confessed. And a lot of the, it's a small rural community, people knew each other, and really the townspeople made it very uncomfortable, not just for the kids, but also for their families. So a lot of parents felt like that they were being blamed unfairly so because they didn't do, sort of a good job raising their kids. So as it happened, this community had access and created a restorative process. And the documentary shows this taking place. Some of the preparation work, and then the actual meeting that took place in the church, and lots of people were there, and the kids got to express themselves, and the parents got to express themselves, and the community members got to express themselves, and the kids felt terrible. And they're like, we didn't know how much this bridge meant to people. We didn't know that, we didn't even know it would burn like this. We didn't, it was sort of like they hadn't thought it out. They were just doing stuff, and they weren't prepared to deal with the consequences. They felt bad. They were afraid. Arson, so the damage assessed was over $600,000. So apart from the sentimental and historical value, you just have that sort of economic cost. They're looking at felonies. They were charged with 4 counts. They went from thinking of themselves as college-bound, with their life ahead of them, to looking at a future that was entirely different from what they had been imagining. So part of it is they're scared, but they also, sort of, want to make things right. They don't have the money to pay for rebuilding the bridge. They don't have the skills to rebuild it themselves, but they've got some ideas about working and contributing money over time, and the community is responsive to this. It seems like they want to bring these kids and their families back into community life. By the way, this is another way that our punitive system fails us. Even if we endorse the idea that that people should do time, right? At the end of that, we don't reintegrate them back into our communities in a way that functions, right? But this community seemed willing, able to do that. There were some legal barriers because they still had legal charges, and this restorative process was not set up to take the place of the criminal justice process. But I stopped the video at this point, and I addressed the kids that I'm showing the film to. And they're, just to give you an idea, the age range is between the age, 14 to 19. Probably 80% of them are black. Probably 90% of them are male. So there, sometimes there are others in the room. And I say, okay, what do you think should happen next? What do you want to see the judge do? Because I tell them that they see it in the documentary, that there's still going to be a court hearing. What do you want to see happen next? And in my mind, what I'm thinking is, what I want to see happen next is for the judge to basically sign off on, endorse, support the agreements that the community was sort of making, giving these kids the opportunity to repair the damage that they had done, and sort of be, again, part of the community. And the kids almost unanimously, and it's not, this isn't a one-time that I do this, right? I show this film periodically to a different group of kids, and the consistent feedback that I get from the kids is, we want to see them do a lot of time. More time than the staff, the JDC staff, maybe a year to kind of, send a message. And these kids are like, no, we want to see them nailed. And I said, well, why? Would you want to be treated the way that you're describing? Would you want to be treated that way by the court? And they said, well, no, we wouldn't, but that's what would happen. We know that the court would lock us up for years, so justice means that those kids who are white also get locked up for years. Our justice system, in the criminal justice, in the school, everywhere, is set up for people to lie to each other, right? the system is set up as oppositional. The judge tells you to put your hand on the Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But your attorney is telling you, don't admit to anything, right? They have to prove their case. Because if you admit to something, you're going to be punished. That's the criminal justice system. In a restorative system, you admit to what you did, you take responsibility, right? The system is set up for people to be honest with each other. Doesn't mean that they always will, but at least the system is set up to encourage that. In a family situation, I'm going to talk for maybe another 5 minutes, and then we'll try to talk together a little bit. In a family situation, it's probably pretty evident how harm can be repaired. People can apologize, can express regret, can take responsibility, can promise and follow through on their promise to do something differently next time. In a neighborhood, if kids break a window, we know what it looks like to repair the harm. Right? We pay for the window to be repaired. If people have skills, they can do the repair themselves. But what about situations like Trayvon Martin? What about situations like Michael Brown? How do we repair that? What does it look like for communities to make things right in a situation like that? So I want to end with a little video clip and tell you a little bit about a case in Seattle that occurred a few years ago. So unfortunately, this is another police shooting, and we've seen too many of them. But this one you probably don't know about because of it, for reasons that, who knows why some stories become national stories and why some just stay local, right? I don't know the answer to that. But this was not a story that became a national story. So I want to show you a clip. There's no, somebody's going to get killed. I want to kind of narrate it just so that you're psychologically ready for that. But what I want to engage you with is not so much what you see in the video, but in what happened afterwards, how the community decided to engage the incident that you're about to see. Okay? So let me go ahead and set that up. And I might need some help. Great. Yep, just got him. Click play. Yeah, don't mess with the volume. There's no volume. Okay. Okay. So what you're seeing is the camera from a squad car, the quad cam. The police officer who's driving, and you can see that this is summer of 2010, the police officer who's driving in Seattle, his name is Ian Burke, and he's driving his car, and you can see it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You can see it's sunny. There's lots of car traffic. There's lots of pedestrian traffic. There is volume in this clip. There's just not any right now. So he's standing on a light. The person crossing the street, his name is John T. Williams. He's a Native American wood carver, and you probably didn't see what he was carrying, but I can tell you, he's carrying a block of wood and his carving knife.
Hey! Hey! Put the knife down! Put the knife down! Put the knife down!
Notice there are many eyewitnesses.
Shots fired, born in hello. Subject wouldn't drop the knife.
Shots fired, born in hello. Units for David 33.
So nothing much exciting happens, from this point on. There are other squad cars that come, and, eventually, paramedics arrive. But John Williams is dead. He killed by the gunshots. There were 4 shots fired. Originally, Officer Burke said that Williams turned and made a threatening gesture, but he later withdrew that statement, in part because there were a number of eyewitnesses who said, no, that didn't happen. He never turned around. The coroner's report also indicated that that the bullets entered, like not quite in the back, but like around here. And as far as we know, and we later learned that Williams had hearing problems. As far as we know, I don't know if he heard or heard, but in any case, he never turned around. So what typically happens in cases like this is that the police do an internal investigation to determine if the shooting was justified. And that's what happened. And the police chief in Seattle at this time was Police Chief Diaz. And he ordered an investigation. And then the outcome now is, starts to make this case different, because most of the time, those investigations determine that the shooting is justified, which doesn't mean that the investigators believe that the police officer should have fired the gun, but that it was permissible for him or her to fire the gun given the circumstances. In this case, the investigation determined that the police officer, that the shooting was not justified. And he was suspended, and there were criminal charges filed, and so that's where things stood for a while. Meanwhile, lots of people are upset. Even though it's not a national story, locally, as you might imagine, lots of people are upset. Obviously, family members are upset. The Native American community in Seattle is upset because guess what? This isn't the first time something like this has happened there. Right? And tension is mounting, in the way that we sort of seen happen elsewhere. The family, meanwhile, reaches out to a law firm, and they're basically wanting to sue the city for damages. And I can't remember the name of the firm, but the lawyer of the firm that is assigned to work with the family is a woman by the name of Andrea Bernicki. And what's interesting about Andrea is that in addition to being an attorney and working for this firm, she has also been a student and a practitioner of restorative justice. And so when she first meets the family and listens to them and understands what's going on, she says to them, yeah, of course, we can go ahead with the lawsuit, and I can help you do that. Or we can do something a little bit differently. And she describes to them what a restorative process might look like. And I don't know why the family agreed. Certainly some families might not have. Maybe it's because the values and the principles of restorative justice were culturally familiar to them as part of First Nations people. Maybe that's why. Maybe it was an unrelated reason. But the family said, okay, yeah, if the city wants to do that, if the police department wants to do that, we're willing to do that. So Andrea goes now to the police chief and says, the family is willing to sit and talk and do a restorative thing. And the chief is under a lot of pressure to, again, lots of folks are upset, and a different chief or the same chief under different circumstances may have said, no way, but the chief said, yeah, we'll do it. And then she went to the city and said, hey, there's, the family wants to do this, the police department wants to do it, will you participate? And the city said, again, we don't necessarily know their motivations. Maybe it was to avoid a lawsuit, so they're not necessarily honorable. But whatever the motivations were, the city also agreed to participate. And so a restorative process was created. And I wasn't there. So I can't tell you sort of, who said what to whom. But what I can tell you is what the agreements that were made during that process. What were the agreements to make things right? So obviously we can't bring back John Williams, and neither can the criminal justice system. But I ask you now, what would you, because it's a generalizable question, right? It's like, what is it that our community needs after Kiwan Carrington was killed? What is it that Ferguson needs after Michael Brown's death? Right? What is it that the community needs to heal, to make it right? What would you ideally like to see happen? Because I have a hypothesis, so I'm not, it's the first time I'm giving this talk, but I have a hypothesis that the things you tell me are going to be the things that they agreed to in the circle. And I have a PDF of their agreements, and if somebody wants it, I made copies for others. So I just want to share it a little bit with you, but what would you want to see happen? Yeah, I can't. Commemoration of John Williams' life. Thank you. That's fabulous.
I want to see a commemoration to the artist and his life and work and community, and maybe something to give back to that community, perhaps in the form of scholarships to Native Americans, to art students, both, something like that.
Yep. So that happened. They created a totem pole. Remember that he was a carver. So they created a totem pole in his honor. It was, the city, really, created a special day, for its sort of unveiling. It was put in the park where he did a lot of his carving, and that happened. And then, the second thing I heard you say is something that is going to be given back to the community. So let's be more specific about that, because lots of things happened with the Native community. So again, what else would you like to see happen?
What was an economic loss in terms of the family and the children?
Sure. Yeah,
In that term.
so there's a potential, there's a loss of potential earnings. He was 50 years old, by the way. So, he was not married. He did not have children. He did have a brother who was alive. He did have a mother who was alive. And, I think there were some other family members. I can't remember exactly, who all of them were. But I don't know that there was, that he was supporting anyone. He was, the way many of us aren't, a perfect human being. So there was no violence in his history. There was a history of substance abuse, as unfortunately is prevalent in Native communities. He supported himself through his carving, essentially as a street musician might support himself through his music, right? So, there wasn't, that was sort of, the lifestyle. But a financial settlement. So the city might compensate the family voluntarily, rather than that being imposed by a court of law. The city might voluntarily enter an agreement to provide financial compensation to the family members. And that did happen as well. I don't have the exact number, but I think it was in the neighborhood of 1 million. Karen?
I would like to see that it wouldn't happen again, that it wasn't going to happen to another Native American carver or someone else.
Yeah, thank you. So a big part of it is we want to see some changes in the way that policing happens in the community. And, okay, so how do we figure out, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again. Well, on one level, there are no guarantees, right? But we can take some steps. So part of the agreements were that the police department agreed to make pretty meaningful changes in the training of its police officers, which included, I mean, there were other things, but it included, learning about native cultures and native people, and sort of the stuff that we might describe more generally as quote-unquote diversity training, became integrated into sort of the police training protocol. It's one change. Importantly, all of the agreements had feedback loops. So it wasn't just that the police department said, yeah, we're going to do things differently. The agreement also included, and we're going to give you regular updates about how that's going. And here's how those updates will be delivered and when. So that happened, right? Another thing that happened is, okay, well, training is, that's something that, is part of the academy. Sometimes there's, continuing education. But we also want the police to actually act differently. So one of the changes that was made was that police officers would spend, this is what community policing is. It's basically spending time with communities, building relationships, getting to know each other, showing up not only when there's an emergency, but showing up to be part of the community, to say, hey, this is who I am. I want to get to know the people here, so that when I show up and there is an emergency, we already have a relationship with each other. So that happened. And sometimes the things that happen have meaning more symbolically than so I can sort of make a distinction between a reparative process and a restorative process. So the reparative thing is, if I break your window, I repair it. The restorative thing might be that if I break a window, I tell you that I didn't mean to do it. I wasn't thinking when I was playing ball by your house. I'm going to make sure that I don't do that in the future, and I'm going to, I'm going to try to make it up to you, right? Like, those words don't fix the window, but they have symbolic meaning, yes? So one of the symbolic agreements was the police chief gave Williams's brother his cell phone number. He says, call me if you need me. Does it change anything? No. But the symbolic meaning is, you matter. I want to be here for you. So there are 4 pages of, yeah.
I'm thinking, this may not have been addressed by them, but I'm thinking about what the young people, I'm thinking about what the young people in the juvenile detention center told you about justice, and wondering whether there could have been that kind of aspect of an equalization of the treatment of the police officer with other people who do such things in Seattle. And I don't mean that punitively, but just in terms of kind of the comparison, which is one part of the harm. It's like there was a specific harm of the individuals, and then there was the general harm that you've alluded to.
So in this particular case, Officer Burke was not part of the circle. Presumably because, this is my understanding, he was being charged with a crime, and his attorneys advised him not to participate, even though part of the agreement in the circle on page 3. This agreement will not be used in litigation, which is not to say that it couldn't be used by prosecution, but that could have been made too. But in any case, the officer who fired the gun was not there, and therefore could not speak for himself, and therefore could not enter into voluntary agreements. But I want to tell you about a different case, right, in which that did happen. So in restorative justice, we're still in a place of firsts. So the case I'm about to tell you is a first. It's the first homicide that, at least that I know of, but I think it's the first one in the United States that was dealt with entirely restoratively. That is, the criminal justice system was a participant, but the criminal justice system itself was not activated. So this was a case also just a few years old. It was written up in the New York Times for the obvious reason. And in this case, a young man in his 20s had a fight with his girlfriend, his fiancée actually, and she said that, she was sort of saying she didn't want to be with him anymore, and he got really, really upset, and he got his gun and he killed her. And because of their relationship with each other, the family members also knew each other. So her family knew him and his family knew her and her family. And in this particular case, the family knew a little bit about restorative justice. And in this case, it was kind of their religious faith, their Christian faith, that kind of motivated them to not just follow along with business as usual, but to try to create something restorative. And so they reached out to people that did that kind of work, and those people reached out to the prosecution. And in this particular case, the prosecutor here it's the state's attorney, the district attorney said, okay, we'll show up. I'll show up. I'll be part of this process. So the way that our criminal justice is set up, when a crime occurs, if I hit this fellow on his head while we're walking down the street, according to the law, I have not committed a crime against him. Is that clear? I've committed a crime against the state because the state says you're not allowed to hit people on their head. Not in so many words, right? So the state has to be represented, and in this case, the district attorney said, okay, I'm going to be there, I'm going to represent the interests of the state. And then everybody else came together, including the person in this case who pulled the trigger, who wasn't really happy with himself, felt really bad about it. But all that aside, again, agreements were made, and in restorative justice, there's sort of the idea that the more voluntary the participation, the more voluntary the agreements, the more restorative the outcomes. The district attorney made it very clear that, we're not getting out of here without prison time, because he has to be accountable to the community, I don't know if it's an elected or appointed position in New York, but there's accountability for him, right? And so that was one of the agreements that were made. And what they settled on was 20 years. But that was an agreement, a voluntary agreement that was entered. And this happened just a few years ago, so he's obviously still serving that time. But what I know about that case since then, by the way, in both of these cases, I know the person who facilitated the process. Part of the reason I can tell you these stories is because, it's not such a big community, and we talk to each other with, respecting confidentiality, of course, but these are also public stories. So where I was going with it is the mom of the daughter visits this young man regularly. And part of her message to him, which, she's sort of spoken about a number of times, is she does not want to see his life go to waste. She wants him to do his time, get out, and then do the good of two people. Because she says, that's what you owe. You took her life. You have to do the good in the world that you would have done, and now you have to do the good in the world that she would have done. And sort of that's the agreement right now. So I think what I heard in your question is there room for the imposition of punishment in a restorative process? There is. So I think we've already kind of started more of a dialogue, but I want to, really open it up and kind of, we have, so on this note, there's sort of the idea that criminal justice is something that we do to people, right? We tell them, those who have authority, we tell them, now this will happen. In restorative justice, we have the idea that justice is something that we do with people, together, collaboratively. So I want to end the part of the talk in which I'm talking to you and enter more of a dialogical space, which is much more comfortable to me, in which we decide what we're going to do and do it together.
Yeah. Question. All right, I got one, and then over on the other end.
You talked about like restorative being a pretty good method, but then there's some crimes, like sexual offense. The way you want to meet the offender, and like, what do you think about maybe restorative policies in those sort of situations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a lot of concern in the restorative justice community about, as there is everywhere else, about re-traumatizing a person who was already harmed. So, from my point of view, there's no reason why a person who was sexually assaulted cannot or should not participate in the restorative process, but I would never want to suggest that he or she has to. It's really their choice, the volunteer. And I want them to make that choice in an informed way, having as much understanding as possible about both the benefits and the potential risks to themselves. And have no, I don't want to force anybody to do anything. And there's no reason why we can't have a restorative process without that person. Just like there was no reason why the city of Seattle couldn't have a restorative process without Officer Burke. So other people were harmed. If there's a, I don't know if you're a student, but if there's a sexual assault on campus, a lot of other people feel harmed by that act, in addition to the person who was actually assaulted. So there's a lot more to restore. And just one other thought. I'm going to use slightly provocative language deliberately. In the context of sexual assault, we sort of have the idea that no means no. And, right? I'm not going to, it's sort of a pretty clear statement. In restorative justice, we kind of have the idea that no is not the end of the conversation. So, which is not to suggest that I want to force somebody to do something against their will. But what I want to do if I hear a no is to understand the good reasons behind the no. What are the specific concerns, and are there specific things that can be done to create conditions where those concerns are not as meaningful, right? Where there's more safety. Does it mean that there is a counselor who accompanies you to the restorative process? Does it mean that the person who did the assault is actually physically in a different room and is communicating using technology? So what does the person need? And at the end of this conversation, we might jointly conclude that, a restorative process is really not in this person's best interest. And that's fine. Or we might reach a different conclusion.
Oh, I didn't know I do have a lot. I have actually helped with a couple of restorative circles and have been amazed at the potential of separation that was prevented. Does that make any sense? I have been in situations where people were never ever going to talk to each other again, and they chose to do a restorative circle. I am now in a situation where a restorative circle would do so much, but I can't. How do I talk to someone and say, I think this is the right way to go, instead of going through the typical things.
Yeah. So what I hear in that question is, how do we create a system and invite somebody to do something that they don't know anything about, that they don't have any familiarity with, they don't have any previous experience with, right? How do we create something new? So I join you in some ways in that, both in the frustration that we don't already have such a system, and in the challenge of, how do we create it? The best answer I can give you at the moment is by being willing to talk about the restorative things that happen in our lives, just to let people know that these are the alternatives. By asking questions and really coming to things with curiosity. Because even if people are really attached to, whatever following, on some level that strategy is probably not working for them. So there's sort of a dialectic where if we try to tell people they should do something different, they'll tell us all the reasons why they shouldn't. But if we ask them, what are you doing? How is it working? Eventually they'll start to tell us about the ways in which it isn't. And that's sort of the way to create an openness to say, well, are you open to hearing about, this other thing that I heard about? I hope that, this is my goal, right? When I go to schools, I sometimes, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with the Danville High School assistant principals. They're interested in creating some restorative ways to deal with their discipline issues. I lost my train of thought. Got it. And I said, okay, some things, you're already doing lots of things. Some of them are working for you. I don't want to take anything away. I want to add something. You have a drop-down menu, right? Those of you who are computer users. There's a drop-down menu. You already have things like ignore it and wait for it to go away. Use punitive methods, yell, threaten, punish, right? It's already there. For younger people, on their menu is fight it out. Older people might have an argue it out, just put it all on the table and just argue it out. So here's one more possibility for you to use if it makes sense for you to do it. A restorative process in which we come together not to convince somebody, but to understand each other and figure out how to make it right.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much again for joining us today.